I had just inherited $25 million after my grandfather passed away. I was about to call my husband and tell him the news when the notary looked at me and said, "According to the system, you've been divorced for 2 months." I froze for 5 seconds. Then I quietly put my phone away. Because in that moment, I realized 2 things. First, my husband had somehow erased me from my own marriage. Second, he had absolutely no idea what I had just inherited. And I decided to keep it that way. My name is Emily Carter, and until that afternoon in Phoenix, Arizona, I believed I had a normal marriage. Not a perfect marriage, not a storybook marriage, just normal. The kind of marriage millions of Americans have. Busy schedules, occasional arguments, bills to pay, vacations planned 6 months in advance, and a husband who forgot anniversaries often enough to be annoying but not alarming. At least that's what I thought. 3 months before everything fell apart, my grandfather Richard's health had taken a serious turn. He was 86 years old and stubborn in the way only old ranchers from Arizona can be. The doctors recommended assisted living. He refused. The doctors recommended full-time nurses. He refused that too. The only person he agreed to accept help from was me. So I packed a few suitcases, took an extended leave from my marketing job in Denver, and moved temporarily into his home outside Phoenix. Jason, my husband of 11 years, stayed behind in Colorado. At the time, it seemed practical. He had a construction management business to run. I had family responsibilities. Neither of us wanted to uproot everything. "We'll get through this," Jason had told me while helping load my bags into the car. He kissed my forehead. "Take care of Grandpa, I'll handle things here." I remember smiling. I remember feeling grateful. God, I was naive. The following months were emotionally exhausting. Grandpa's condition gradually worsened. Some days he seemed almost normal. Other days he forgot what year it was. I drove him to appointments. I organized medications. I sat beside his hospital bed during long nights when sleep felt impossible. Jason called regularly. Every evening around 8. Without fail. "How's he doing today?" he'd ask. "About the same." "And how are you?" "I'm okay." "You sound tired." "I am tired." "Get some sleep, Em." Sometimes he stayed on the phone for an hour. Sometimes only 10 minutes. But he always called. Always. Looking back, that's the part that still amazes me. The performance. The dedication. The sheer effort he put into pretending. Because while I was helping my grandfather through the final chapter of his life, my husband was quietly writing the ending of our marriage. I just didn't know it yet. In late September, Grandpa's health declined rapidly. The doctors warned me that we were running out of time. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, he motioned for me to sit beside him. His voice was weak. "Emily, I'm here. You know I've always been proud of you, right?" My throat tightened. "Grandpa..." "No, listen." His weathered hand squeezed mine. "You've got more strength than you realize." I tried to smile. He smiled back. Then he said something that wouldn't make sense until months later. "Never let anyone convince you that your value depends on what they think of you." At the time, I assumed he was talking generally. A grandfather offering wisdom. Nothing more. I had no idea those words would become the foundation of everything that followed. 3 days later, he passed away peacefully in his sleep. The grief hit me harder than I expected. My grandfather had helped raise me after my parents divorced. He taught me how to drive, how to fish, how to negotiate, how to stand up for myself. Losing him felt like losing an entire era of my life. Jason called immediately after I told him. His voice sounded genuinely sympathetic. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart." "Thank you. I wish I could be there." "I know. You don't have to handle this alone." The irony still makes me laugh. Not because it's funny, because it's unbelievable. A week later, after the funeral, I met with a notary and the attorney handling Grandpa's estate. I expected paperwork. I expected legal discussions. I expected maybe a modest inheritance. Nothing more. Instead, I learned that my grandfather had spent decades quietly building a remarkable portfolio of investments. Commercial properties, energy stocks, land holdings, trust accounts. The total value exceeded $25 million. I genuinely thought I had misheard the number. The attorney repeated it, then repeated it again. I sat there speechless. Grandpa had never lived extravagantly. His pickup truck was older than some college students. His favorite restaurant served $12 breakfasts. You would never have guessed he was worth that kind of money. Apparently, he preferred it that way. The attorney slid several documents across the table. My hands were shaking. Not because of greed, because the amount felt unreal, life-changing, generational. I reached for my phone almost automatically. There was only one person I wanted to tell. Jason. My husband. The man who had supposedly supported me through the hardest months of my life. The man I believed I would spend the rest of my life with. I was already pulling up his contact when the notary frowned at his computer screen. His expression changed. Just slightly, but enough for me to notice. Is something wrong? I asked. He looked uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Then he turned the monitor slightly toward himself, typed something, paused, and looked back at me. Mrs. Carter. The hesitation immediately made my stomach tighten. Yes? There's something unusual here. I lowered my phone. What do you mean? The room suddenly felt smaller. The attorney stopped organizing paperwork. Neither man looked comfortable. Finally, the notary cleared his throat. According to the system, you've been divorced for 2 months. For a moment, I honestly thought he had confused me with someone else. I even laughed. A short, confused laugh. I'm sorry? He turned the screen toward me. My name. Jason's name. Case number. Court records. Finalized. 2 months earlier. The air disappeared from my lungs. No. The word came out automatically. Quietly. Almost like a prayer. The notary looked genuinely concerned. I'm very sorry. I stared at the screen, then stared harder, trying to force reality to change, trying to find the mistake. But the information remained exactly where it was. Unmoving. Unforgiving. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe 5 seconds. Maybe 10. Maybe an entire lifetime compressed into a single moment. Then something strange happened. I stopped shaking. Not because I was calm. Because some deeper instinct had taken over. I slowly locked my phone screen. Jason's name disappeared. I placed the phone face down on the table. And instead of crying, screaming, or demanding answers, I asked one simple question. Can I have copies of everything? The attorney exchanged a glance with the notary, then nodded. Of course. As they gathered documents, a thought formed in the back of my mind. Small. Cold. Dangerously clear. If Jason had done this? If he had somehow divorced me without my knowledge? Then calling him right now would be the worst mistake I could make. Because the one advantage I still had was this. He didn't know that I knew. And for the first time all afternoon, I felt something stronger than grief. Stronger than confusion. Curiosity. I wanted to know what my husband thought he'd accomplished. And more importantly, I wanted to know what he would do if he believed I was still completely in the dark. The first thing I learned after leaving that office was that shock behaves differently than people expect. Movies show dramatic breakdowns. People collapsing into tears. Screaming. Throwing things. Demanding answers. Real life wasn't like that. Real life was driving back to my hotel through Phoenix traffic while somehow obeying every stoplight. It was standing in line at a coffee shop because your body still expected caffeine even though your world had just exploded. It was sitting alone in a hotel room, staring at a wall for 40 minutes, because your brain couldn't decide which disaster deserved attention first. My grandfather was dead. I had inherited $25 million. And apparently I had been divorced for 2 months. The human mind isn't designed to process all three in the same afternoon. That evening, Jason called at exactly 8:03 p.m. Just like always. His name appeared on my phone screen. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. Then I answered. Hey, I said. My voice sounded surprisingly normal. Hey, sweetheart? Sweetheart. The word almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny. Because according to the state of Colorado, he hadn't been my husband for 2 months. Yet here he was, calling me sweetheart. How are you holding up? He asked. I walked toward the hotel window and looked out at the city lights. I'm managing. I'm worried about you. The performance was flawless. Warm. Concerned. Patient. If I hadn't seen the court records with my own eyes, I would have believed every word. I'll be okay, I said. You don't have to be strong all the time. Another perfect line. Another carefully delivered piece of emotional support. For the first time in 11 years, I listened to my husband the way a stranger would. Not hearing what he said. Hearing what he might be hiding. We talked for another 15 minutes. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. No hints. No slips. When the call ended, I sat on the edge of the bed and realized something terrifying. Jason had become very good at lying. Nobody develops that level of skill overnight. The next morning, I met with a lawyer named Sarah Whitmore. She specialized in fraud cases and contested divorces. After reviewing the documents, she leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. This is highly unusual. Unusual how? Finalized divorces require notifications, signatures, verification procedures. I nodded. I never signed anything. I believe you. She tapped one of the documents. The question is how this happened. For the next hour, we examined every page. The more we reviewed, the stranger things became. An address appeared on several documents. An apartment address in Denver. I had never lived there. Never received mail there. Never even heard of it. Can they really change an address like this? I asked. Sarah frowned. They can submit one. Without my permission? They shouldn't. Shouldn't. Not couldn't. Shouldn't. That distinction bothered me. By the end of the meeting, Sarah recommended 2 immediate actions. First, obtain complete court records. Second, hire a private investigator. If someone went to this much effort, she said, there may be more going on than a simple divorce. That afternoon, I hired the investigator. His name was Mark Delaney. Former law enforcement. Quiet. Methodical. The kind of man who seemed incapable of exaggeration. He listened carefully while I explained the situation. When I finished, he asked only one question. Do you want the truth? The wording surprised me. Of course. Even if it's worse than you think? I swallowed. Especially if it's worse than I think. He nodded. Then he opened a notebook. Let's start. For the next several days, I remained in Arizona. Officially, I was still handling estate matters. Unofficially, I was building a case. Meanwhile, Jason continued his routine. Every evening he called. Every evening he played the role of devoted husband. And every evening I played the role of unsuspecting wife. The strangest part was how quickly the deception became exhausting. Not because I struggled to hide my anger. Because I struggled to understand him. 11 years. 11 years together. Birthdays. Holidays. Road trips. Hospital visits. Job changes. Family gatherings. How does someone erase 11 years and then casually call you every night? The question haunted me. A week later, Mark called. I found something. His tone immediately sharpened my attention. What is it? Can you meet? An hour later, we sat across from each other in a quiet restaurant. He slid a folder across the table. I opened it and felt my stomach drop. Photographs. Jason. A woman. Different locations. Restaurants. A wine bar. A shopping center. A concert venue. The dates stretched back nearly a year. My chest tightened. Who's she? Name's Brittany Lawson. I stared at her picture. Blonde. Maybe early 30s. Attractive. Confident. The type of woman who looked comfortable being the center of attention. How long? At least 11 months. Almost a year. While I had been sleeping beside him. Planning vacations. Discussing retirement. Building a future. My husband had been building a second life. I expected tears. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Not numb. Focused. Like a puzzle was finally revealing its shape. Does she know about me? Mark looked uncomfortable. Based on what I've found... What? I don't think she's the secret. I stared at him. What does that mean? It means she appears to believe the marriage ended months ago. The room suddenly felt colder. Because that changed everything. An affair is one kind of betrayal. But this? This suggested planning. Narrative control. A deliberate effort to rewrite reality, as if I had simply vanished from the story. Over the next few days, more information emerged. Brittany had been spending significant time at my house. Not Jason's house. Our house. The home we purchased together 9 years earlier. The home where every wall color had been chosen together. The home where every mortgage payment had come from both of us. Now another woman was walking through it. Sleeping there. Living there. While I sat hundreds of miles away caring for my dying grandfather. The cruelty of it felt almost artistic. But then Mark discovered something even more important. The house had recently been listed for sale. Not publicly yet. Preparations only. Documents. Communications. Early discussions with a realtor. I looked up from the report. He wants to sell it? It appears so. My pulse accelerated. Because suddenly everything made sense. The fake divorce. The altered address. The urgency. The secrecy. Jason wasn't trying to leave the marriage. He was trying to erase evidence that the marriage had ever existed. And he was moving fast. Fast enough that if I waited too long, the damage could become irreversible. That night, Jason called again. His voice sounded cheerful. Relaxed. Completely unaware. "How was your day?" he asked. I sat alone in my hotel room, surrounded by reports documenting his lies. It was productive. Good. What about yours? There was a brief pause. Just a fraction of a second. Then, same old stuff. I almost smiled, because for the first time, I knew something he didn't. His secret wasn't a secret anymore. And while he believed he was controlling the narrative, I had quietly started writing a new ending. A week later, I flew back to Colorado. Not home. Not yet. The temptation was certainly there. Part of me wanted to drive straight to the house, walk through the front door, and demand an explanation. I wanted to see Jason's face when he realized I knew. I wanted to hear whatever ridiculous story he had prepared. I wanted answers. But anger is expensive. It costs perspective. It costs patience. And most importantly, it costs leverage. So instead of going home, I checked into a Marriott about 20 minutes away and began living a strange double life. Officially, I was still handling estate matters in Arizona. Unofficially, I was sitting in Colorado, quietly watching my husband destroy himself. The first morning after I arrived, Mark met me in the hotel lobby. He carried another folder. Thicker this time. That wasn't encouraging. "More bad news?" I asked. He gave a small shrug. "Depends how you look at it." We sat in a private meeting room near the business center. Then he began laying documents across the table. Bank statements. Credit card records. Property reports. Expense summaries. The deeper we dug, the uglier the picture became. Jason hadn't simply been having an affair. He had been funding one. Designer handbags. Luxury weekends. Spa packages. Plane tickets. Jewelry. Thousands of dollars. Tens of thousands, actually. And not from his personal spending account. From accounts connected to our marital finances. I stared at the paperwork. At first I felt angry, then disappointed, then strangely embarrassed. Not because of what he had done, because I hadn't seen it. For nearly a year I had trusted him completely. I believed what he told me. I assumed our shared goals were still shared. Meanwhile, he'd been using our money to build a future with someone else. "There's more," Mark said. Of course there was. There was always more. He slid another page forward. An investment account. One I recognized. Jason and I had opened it years earlier. A conservative long-term portfolio intended for retirement. I immediately noticed several withdrawals. Large withdrawals. "What is this?" "Money transfers." My voice hardened. "To where?" He showed me. The funds had eventually found their way into accounts associated with a small real estate venture. One that Brittany was connected to. I leaned back slowly. At this point, I wasn't even surprised anymore. Jason wasn't simply cheating. He was redistributing assets. Preparing for a life after me. And apparently, he'd decided to finance that future with money that belonged to both of us. The meeting lasted almost 3 hours. By the end, I had learned enough to understand something important. This wasn't emotional recklessness. This was strategy. Bad strategy. Criminal strategy, perhaps. But strategy nonetheless. Which meant I needed to think strategically, too. That afternoon, I met Sarah at her office. She reviewed everything Mark had gathered. When she finished, she removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. Well, that wasn't a promising start. Well, what? You have more leverage than I expected. I wasn't interested in leverage. I was interested in justice. Unfortunately, adults eventually learn those are often the same thing. Sarah organized the evidence into categories. Potential fraud, questionable transfers, property concerns, possible perjury. Every new category represented another problem for Jason. What happens if we move now? I asked. We could. But we'd only know part of the story. She pointed toward one of the folders. People who commit fraud rarely stop after one act. That sentence stayed with me. People who commit fraud rarely stop after one act. The truth is, betrayal changes the way you view the past. Suddenly, every memory becomes suspect. Every explanation gets re-examined. Every coincidence becomes a potential clue. Over the next several days, I found myself replaying years of conversations. The business trips. The late meetings. The forgotten weekends. The unexpected expenses. Events I'd dismissed at the time now looked different. Not necessarily because they were lies. Because I no longer trusted my ability to identify lies. That realization hurt more than the affair. One evening, while reviewing documents in my hotel room, I came across an old photo on my phone. Jason and me. Yellowstone National Park. 5 years earlier. We were standing beside a lake, smiling at the camera. I stared at the image for a long time. Then I asked myself a question. When did he stop loving me? The answer never came. Because maybe that wasn't the right question. Maybe the real question was, when did he start believing he could get away with this? The next major development arrived 3 days later. Mark called. I think you should see something. Where? I'll text you the address. An hour later, I sat inside my rental car across the street from my own house. The house looked exactly the same. Same lawn, same porch, same maple tree near the driveway. Yet somehow it felt foreign. Like a place I used to know. Mark parked beside me, then handed me a pair of binoculars. I almost laughed. This feels illegal. It isn't. I looked through them, and immediately saw Brittany. She stepped out the front door carrying a coffee mug. My coffee mug. A blue ceramic mug I'd bought years earlier. The absurd detail nearly broke my heart. Not because it mattered. Because it was ordinary. Intimate. Familiar. She wasn't visiting. She wasn't sneaking around. She was living there. A few minutes later, Jason appeared. He kissed her. Then helped load groceries into the house. The sight hit harder than I expected. Not because I still wanted him. That part was already dying. Because I realized something. Neither of them looked worried. Neither of them looked guilty. They looked comfortable. Safe? Certain. Which meant Jason genuinely believed his plan had worked. I lowered the binoculars. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Mark quietly said, "You okay?" I considered the question. No, it was the truth. I don't think I ever will be completely okay with this. He nodded. That answer seemed to satisfy him. Because healing and forgiveness are not the same thing. And at that moment, I wasn't interested in forgiveness. I was interested in accountability. The breakthrough came 4 days later. Sarah called just after noon. Her voice carried a level of excitement I hadn't heard before. We got it. I sat upright. Got what? The signature analysis? My heart started pounding. The forensic examiner had completed his review. The signatures used during the divorce proceedings were fraudulent. Not similar. Not questionable. Fraudulent. The report was definitive. Someone had forged my name. I closed my eyes. Even though I'd suspected it from the beginning, hearing confirmation felt different. More final. More real. Because now we weren't dealing with misunderstandings. We weren't dealing with relationship problems. We weren't even dealing with infidelity. We were dealing with evidence. Hard evidence. Courtroom evidence. The kind that doesn't care about excuses. The kind that survives cross-examination. The kind that changes outcomes. That evening, Jason called as usual. For a moment, I considered ignoring him. Then I answered. Hey. Hey, sweetheart. There was that word again. Sweetheart. I wondered if he had any idea how ridiculous it sounded now. How's Colorado? I asked casually. There was a brief pause. Busy. I smiled, not because anything was funny. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something unexpected. Confidence. Jason still believed he was manipulating the story. He still believed I was grieving in Arizona. He still believed his secrets were secure. What he didn't know was that every day he continued lying, the case against him became stronger. And what he definitely didn't know was that somewhere in a secure legal file sat a forensic report proving the divorce he depended on was built on a forgery. The foundation beneath his entire new life had already started cracking. He just hadn't heard the sound yet. By the beginning of November, I had settled into a routine that would have seemed impossible just a few months earlier. Every morning I met with lawyers, investigators, accountants, or estate advisors. Every evening I spoke to my ex-husband as if none of it existed. It was exhausting. Not because pretending was difficult. Because it forced me to spend time with a version of Jason that no longer felt real. The man I married had become a memory. The man calling me every night was a performance. And somehow he still believed I was the audience. The legal side of things was progressing steadily. Sarah had assembled an impressive team. A forensic accountant was tracing financial transfers. A fraud specialist was reviewing court records. Another attorney was preparing motions to challenge the divorce judgment. The strategy was simple. Move carefully. Move quietly. Move only when the evidence was overwhelming. Jason had spent months building his deception. We were going to dismantle it piece by piece. One Tuesday afternoon, Sarah invited me into a conference room. Several thick folders sat on the table. I immediately knew something important had happened. She smiled. Not a friendly smile. A lawyer's smile. The kind lawyers save for moments when facts become dangerous. What? I asked. She slid a document toward me. I looked down, then looked again, and then a third time. Because I wanted to be absolutely certain. Is this what I think it is? It is. The document contained sworn statements Jason had submitted during the divorce process. Statements made under penalty of perjury. Statements that were demonstrably false. Not opinions. Not misunderstandings. False facts. Specific facts. The kind judges tend to take personally. I slowly set the paper down. So he lied to the court. Repeatedly. I stared out the conference room window. Downtown Denver bustled below. People crossed intersections. Construction crews worked nearby. Life continued normally. Meanwhile, my own life felt like a legal thriller nobody would believe if I described it. Sarah continued. The fraud is serious. How serious? She paused. Serious enough that I suspect his attorney wasn't aware. That got my attention. Because lawyers generally don't enjoy discovering their clients have been lying to them. The consequences can spread quickly. Very quickly. Over the next several weeks, the pressure increased. Not publicly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Strategically. Court filings appeared. Requests for records were submitted. Financial institutions received notices. Certain transactions became more difficult. Certain questions started being asked. And for the first time, Jason began noticing. I could hear it in his voice. Subtle changes. Longer pauses. Less confidence. More curiosity. One evening, he called nearly 20 minutes later than usual. That alone was unusual. Jason was a creature of habit. When he finally called, his tone seemed slightly off. Hey. You sound tired. I smiled to myself. Estate stuff. That wasn't technically a lie. Still dealing with paperwork? More than I expected. Another pause. Then, everything okay financially? There it was. A small question. A casual question. The kind people ask when they're fishing. My pulse remained steady. Why wouldn't it be? No reason. Of course. No reason. I changed the subject. A few minutes later, the call ended. Afterward, I sat quietly in my hotel room, thinking about that question. Everything okay financially? Jason didn't know about the inheritance. Not officially. But something was making him nervous. The legal pressure, perhaps. Or maybe simple instinct. People who live inside lies eventually become sensitive to changes in the environment. Like animals sensing a storm. A few days later, I received another surprise. Not from Jason. From Brittany. Technically, she had no idea who I was. At least not officially. But the investigator had continued monitoring public activity connected to both of them. And according to his report, things were changing. The relationship wasn't as perfect as it appeared. Arguments had become more frequent. Public outings less common. Several sources connected to Jason's social circle reported tension. At first, I didn't understand why. Then Mark explained. People who cheat together often imagine they'll be happy once the spouse is gone. I nodded. Then what happens? They discover the affair wasn't solving problems. That made sense. Affairs thrive on fantasy. Real life is much less cooperative. A week later, another piece of the puzzle appeared. One of Jason's business partners reached out unexpectedly. Not to me directly. To Sarah. Apparently, questions regarding certain financial records had started circulating. Questions Jason couldn't answer convincingly. Questions that created concern. By Thanksgiving, the pressure had become impossible for him to ignore. Then, something happened that changed the entire game. I was meeting with my estate advisor in Phoenix when my phone rang. Sarah. I answered immediately. What happened? Her voice sounded unusually satisfied. He knows. I sat upright. Knows what? The inheritance. For several seconds, I simply stared ahead. Because I had always known this moment would arrive. I just hadn't expected it yet. How? One of the estate filings became accessible. I closed my eyes. $25 million. The number still felt unreal. Now Jason knew it too. Sarah continued. We've already confirmed his behavior changed. How? 3 phone calls. What? 3 phone calls to his attorney within 90 minutes. I couldn't help laughing. Not because it was funny. Because it was predictable. For months, Jason had treated me like a problem he successfully eliminated. Now, suddenly, I had become valuable again. The timing spoke volumes. That evening he called. Right on schedule. His voice sounded different. Careful. Measured. Almost nervous. For the first time since this began, I sensed uncertainty. How are you? He asked. I'm okay. Good. Another pause. Then another. Jason rarely struggled with conversation. Tonight he seemed distracted. Finally, he cleared his throat. So, I heard the estate situation turned out better than expected. There it was. The moment. The first crack. I kept my tone neutral. It was certainly surprising. That's amazing. Amazing. Interesting choice of words. Not heartbreaking. Not emotional. Not life-changing. Amazing. As if he were discussing a stock tip. I thanked him. Then let him keep talking. And the more he talked, the more obvious it became. Jason was scared. Not because he missed me. Not because he regretted hurting me. Because $25 million had appeared in a story he thought was already finished. A story where he had carefully written me out. Now he was desperately trying to find his way back into the manuscript. The problem was that he still didn't know something important. The inheritance wasn't the threat. The evidence was... And while he spent his energy worrying about money, the legal case continued growing stronger every single day. For months, Jason believed he was the smartest person in the room. Soon, he was about to discover how dangerous that assumption could be. The transformation began almost immediately. For months, Jason had spoken to me with the comfortable confidence of a man who believed the hardest part was behind him. He thought he had escaped the marriage, secured the house, established a new life with Brittany, and closed the door on our shared history. Then he learned about the inheritance. And suddenly nothing was settled anymore. 3 days after discovering the news, he called twice in one afternoon. That had never happened before. When I answered the second call, his voice carried an urgency that immediately stood out. Hey, sorry to bother you again. It's fine. I was just thinking... Of course he was. Yeah, maybe when you're back in Colorado, we could sit down and talk. I remained silent for a moment. Talk about what? Another pause. I don't know. Everything. Everything. Such a convenient word. Large enough to hide inside. Vague enough to avoid responsibility. For 11 years, Jason had always been good with words. Unfortunately for him, I had finally learned to listen carefully. I've got a lot going on right now, I said. Of course. His disappointment was obvious. And strangely satisfying. Not because I enjoyed seeing him unhappy. Because for the first time, he was experiencing uncertainty. The same uncertainty he'd forced upon me. After the call ended, I sat quietly in my Phoenix hotel room and reflected on how quickly people reveal themselves when money enters the conversation. The truth is, $25 million hadn't changed who Jason was. It had simply removed his mask. Before learning about the inheritance, he believed I had nothing to offer him. After learning about it, he suddenly wanted conversations. Closure. Understanding. Possibly reconciliation. The timing was impossible to ignore. A week later, I returned to Colorado permanently. Not to my house. Legally speaking, the situation surrounding the property was still being addressed. Instead, I rented a furnished townhouse in a quiet neighborhood outside Denver. It wasn't extravagant. Just comfortable. Private. Peaceful. For the first time in months, I had a place where nobody could lie to me. The legal proceedings accelerated quickly. By now, Sarah's team had assembled a mountain of evidence. Financial records, forensic reports, electronic communications, property documentation, witness statements. Every piece fit together with uncomfortable precision. The fake address, the forged signatures, the concealed transfers, the false statements submitted during court proceedings. Separately, each issue looked serious. Together, they looked devastating. One afternoon, Sarah invited me to review preparations for the upcoming hearing. As she organized documents across the conference table, I noticed something. She seemed unusually confident. "What's changed?" I asked. She smiled. "Jason's attorney." "What about him?" "He finally understands what happened." That surprised me. "How do you know?" "Because he contacted us." I stared at her. "That wasn't good news for Jason." "Not at all." Sarah explained that once the attorney realized critical information had been withheld, his position became extremely uncomfortable. Nobody likes discovering they've unknowingly helped present fraudulent information to a court, particularly judges. The legal landscape was shifting. Rapidly. And Jason was running out of places to hide. Around the same time, his personal life began falling apart as well. According to Mark, the relationship with Brittany was deteriorating. Badly. Arguments had become frequent. Trust was disappearing. And perhaps, most predictably of all, Brittany had started asking difficult questions. Questions about money. Questions about honesty. Questions about timelines. Apparently, she had discovered that some of Jason's stories didn't align with reality. Imagine that. A man who lied to his wife also lied to his girlfriend. Who could have predicted such a shocking development? One evening, Jason called again. This time, he sounded exhausted. Not sad. Not reflective. Exhausted. The difference matters. "Can we meet?" he asked. I was sitting on my patio, watching the sunset disappear behind the mountains. "Why?" "Because I owe you an explanation." The statement lingered in the air. Months earlier, I might have welcomed it. Begged for it, even. Now it felt strangely unnecessary. Because explanations only matter when facts are missing. And at this point, I had plenty of facts. "What explanation?" His voice softened. "Emily, things got complicated." Complicated. Another favorite word. People use it when simple truths sound too ugly. "You forged my signature." Silence. Complete silence. For several seconds, I thought the call had disconnected. Then, not a question. A realization. I looked toward the fading horizon. Yes. Another long pause followed. The sound of a man realizing the game had ended. Not today. Not this moment. Months ago. He just hadn't noticed. "When did you find out?" "At the notary's office." I could almost hear him calculating. Reconstructing timelines. Reviewing conversations. Understanding. You knew this whole time? Yes. The silence that followed lasted nearly 10 seconds. Then he laughed once. A short, defeated laugh. Not because anything was funny. Because he finally understood. All those nightly phone calls. All those lies. All those performances. I had been sitting quietly on the other side of the stage, watching. I don't understand, he said. Understand what? Why didn't you say anything? The question genuinely fascinated me, because it revealed how differently we viewed the situation. Jason assumed confrontation was inevitable. That anger should be immediate. That revenge should be loud. He still didn't understand what patience can accomplish. I wanted the truth. His breathing slowed. And did you get it? More than enough. The hearing took place 3 weeks later. No dramatic television courtroom moments. No shouting. No surprise witnesses bursting through doors. Real life is usually quieter. More procedural. More methodical. And in many ways more devastating. The evidence spoke for itself. The forensic signature analysis. The fraudulent address records. The financial transfers. The inconsistencies in sworn statements. Piece by piece, the foundation beneath Jason's narrative collapsed. Watching it happen felt strangely unemotional. Not because I didn't care. Because I'd already processed the grief. Months earlier. Alone. In hotel rooms. On airplanes. During sleepless nights. By the time the hearing arrived, sadness had largely been replaced by clarity. And clarity is remarkably difficult to defeat. Afterward, Jason approached me outside the courthouse. For the first time in months, we stood face to face. He looked older. More tired. Smaller somehow. Not physically. Emotionally. The confidence was gone. The certainty was gone. The arrogance was gone. Only consequences remained. I'm sorry. I believed he meant it. At least partially. The problem was that apologies arrive too late more often than people realize. He lowered his eyes. I never thought any of this would happen. That was probably true too. Most people don't anticipate consequences while they're creating causes. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I gave him the most honest answer I could. Neither did I. And with that, I walked away. A few months after the hearing, the final rulings arrived. By then, winter had settled across Colorado. Snow-covered rooftops. Bare tree branches stretched across pale skies. And for the first time in nearly a year, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a very long time. Peace. Not happiness. Not yet. Healing isn't a switch you flip. It's a process. Slow. Uneven. Sometimes frustrating. But peace had finally begun to appear. The court ultimately ruled in my favor on the major issues. The fraudulent divorce judgment was overturned. The forged documents became part of the official record. Several financial transfers were unwound. Property disputes were resolved through proper legal channels. And Jason was held accountable for actions he had spent months trying to conceal. The outcome wasn't dramatic. Nobody went to prison. Nobody lost everything overnight. Real justice rarely resembles movie justice. Instead, it looked like consequences. Financial penalties. Legal expenses. Professional damage. A reputation permanently altered by documented dishonesty. The truth followed him wherever he went. And unlike lies, truth doesn't require maintenance. It simply exists. Many people later asked whether I felt victorious. The answer surprised them. Not really. Satisfied? Yes. Relieved? Absolutely. Victorious? No. Because victory implies competition. And I had never wanted to compete with Jason. I had wanted honesty. I had wanted loyalty. I had wanted the marriage I believed I already had. No courtroom ruling could give me those things. Still, there was something deeply satisfying about seeing accountability arrive. Not because it hurt him. Because it restored balance. For nearly a year, Jason had manipulated reality for his own benefit. Eventually, reality pushed back. And that mattered. One afternoon in February, I received a message from Mark. The investigation was officially complete. Everything had been documented. Everything had been resolved. As I read his final report, I found myself thinking about the first day we met. Do you want the truth? Even if it's worse than you think? At the time, I had answered yes. Now I understood the true cost of that answer. Truth is expensive. Sometimes it destroys relationships. Sometimes it destroys illusions. Sometimes it destroys the future you thought you were building. But lies cost even more. They simply send the bill later. A few weeks after that, I made a decision that had been growing quietly in my mind for months. I established the Richard Carter Scholarship Foundation, named after my grandfather, the man who had unknowingly changed my life twice. Once by raising me, and once by leaving me the resources to rebuild after betrayal. The foundation focused on helping students from rural communities attend college, especially students whose families lacked financial opportunities. The kind of young people my grandfather never forgot. The kind of people he spent his entire life helping. The first scholarship ceremony took place that summer. Nothing extravagant. A community center. A modest gathering. Families. Teachers. Students. As I watched those young men and women accept their awards, something unexpected happened. For the first time since Grandpa died, I smiled without forcing it. Because suddenly the inheritance wasn't about money anymore. It was about legacy. About purpose. About transforming pain into something useful. Later that evening after the event ended, I drove alone to a small property outside Phoenix. The old ranch. Grandpa's ranch. The place where I learned how to ride horses. The place where he taught me to change a tire. The place where he taught me that self-respect isn't something other people give you. It's something you protect. The house sat quietly beneath the Arizona sunset. Much of it looked exactly as I remembered. The porch. The fence. The weathered wooden swing. I sat there for nearly an hour. Just thinking. Remembering. Listening to the wind move through the desert grass. Eventually, I pulled an old photograph from my purse. A picture of Grandpa and me from years earlier. I smiled. Then I remembered one of our final conversations. The one I hadn't fully understood at the time. Never let anyone convince you that your value depends on what they think of you. Back then, I assumed he was offering general advice. Now I understood. Whether he realized it or not, he'd given me the exact lesson I would eventually need. Jason's greatest mistake wasn't the affair. It wasn't the forged signature. It wasn't the fraudulent divorce. His greatest mistake was believing my value depended on his opinion of me. He looked at me and saw someone ordinary. Someone replaceable. Someone he could quietly erase. And because he believed that, he stopped being careful. He stopped respecting boundaries. He stopped respecting truth. Most importantly, he stopped respecting consequences. In the end, that arrogance cost him far more than the marriage. As for Brittany, I eventually heard she left Colorado and started over elsewhere. I never contacted her. Never confronted her. Never sought revenge against her. Whatever role she played, the responsibility for Jason's choices belonged to Jason. That distinction mattered. Too many people spend their lives punishing secondary characters while ignoring the main problem. I had no interest in doing that. Several years have passed since then. The foundation continues to grow. The investments remain healthy. Life has moved forward. And yes, eventually I found love again. Not immediately. Not dramatically. Not through some fairy tale coincidence. Just gradually. The way healthy things often happen. Slowly. Naturally. Built on trust instead of promises. But if there's one lesson I carry from everything that happened, it's this. Revenge doesn't always mean destruction. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is refusing to become bitter. Refusing to let betrayal define you. Refusing to allow someone else's dishonesty to determine your future. Jason thought he was writing the final chapter of my story when he forged those papers. He thought he was closing a door. What he didn't realize was that he was only closing one chapter. The next chapter belonged to me. And unlike him, I wrote mine honestly. Thank you for listening to this story. If this journey resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever discovered a betrayal that completely changed the way you saw someone? Do you believe forgiveness and accountability can exist at the same time? Share your perspective in the comments below, and if you enjoy thoughtful stories about resilience, justice, and second chances, please consider subscribing to the channel and joining us for the next story. Until next time, take care of yourselves and never underestimate your own worth.